streets of New York City. Porkins Policy Radio. Here's Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond. You can find the show here live every Tuesday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time at Ocelli.com. Of course, you can also find the show at my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. If you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. Of course, everything will be archived over at Ocelli.com as well as on my website, PorkinsPolicyReview.com. You can follow the RSS feed directly over on my site. You can get email updates. Of course, you can subscribe on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM, Podbean. Pretty much all minor and major podcatchers will have the stream. Of course, if you listen on a particular podcatcher that I don't mention on the show, please let me know so we can link up to it on the website. And I am also, of course, on YouTube, so you can always subscribe on YouTube. If you do listen on YouTube, definitely give us a thumbs up if you enjoy the episode. If you listen on iTunes, then please do give us a rating, leave us a nice review. That helps out tremendously, and I'm super appreciative of everybody that has gone and made a review or written something nice. If you would like to support my work, then you can always go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond, and you can sign up to be a subscriber for as little as $1 a month. And that single solitary dollar, of course, gives you access to the exclusive bonus podcast. I know that I was late with the podcast. Or I wasn't late. I didn't get the podcast in on time the last time around. But I will have something for this month, rest assured. Hopefully it will be a conversation with a good friend and frequent guest, Robbie Martin. And I want to have him on to talk about the film Bob Roberts. So definitely check that out if you haven't already seen the film. And hopefully we will be recording that in the next couple of days. Some quick bit of housekeeping. Excuse me, a little bit of housekeeping. If I sound a little bit flustered, then and out of breath, that is because my heart is racing a little bit. We had to do a quick change of recording venue. I am not recording at my apartment. I'm actually at my girlfriend's apartment right now, and that is because just as I was getting ready to start the show, or at least to talk with Chuck beforehand, get my notes in order, I looked down and saw a small rat crawling right by my feet in the crappy apartment that I live in, and I just got the hell out of there. And so I'm a little on edge at the moment, and that is why we were just a touch late in getting on the show. We're about maybe 2 minutes or so late. So we'll of course make that count a little bit later on. But that is why I am a little bit frazzled at the moment. But anyway, the rest of the housekeeping, I just wanted to update everyone. I've gotten a couple of emails over the past couple of weeks and even last month as well, people asking if I was going to be doing any more work with John Atack, and I can tell you that I am going to be doing more work with John Atack. Both of us, we've been chatting over the past couple of days, and we are both eager to get back to doing some episodes. Hopefully it'll actually be some video. And look out for those sometime in July after I move apartments, which is also happening. My girlfriend and I are moving in together, so there won't be any more rats running around my feet, which is just, I guess, a sad reality of some apartments in New York City. But I will be moving, so there will be some dates where I probably won't be able to do the show early in July. It'll probably only be one day, and I'll let everybody know when that is. and hopefully we'll get someone to maybe we'll try to get someone to do like a guest spot. That might be fun, and take the regular 3 to 5 p.m. slot, and maybe we'll get a guest host. And very quickly, finally, speaking of guest hosts, I won't be able to make it tonight for my regular appearance on the Ocelli Effect, but good friend Robbie Martin will be filling in for me. So definitely check that out. Tonight it'll be from 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Robbie will be taking my spot. And also, I just another quick update. There will be some new episodes of Porkins Great Game. It won't be for a little while, but look out for something hopefully towards the end of the summer, late in August, early September. Christoph and I are just trying to figure out some time when we can both sit down and record stuff, but I just wanted to let people know about that as well, because I do endlessly get emails about when Porkins Great Game is coming back. But anyway, that is enough of me rambling on. I am very excited about our guest today. We are joined on the line by Folly Ado, who is a comic book illustrator and writer. He is the author and illustrator of Black Budget, which is a fantastic comic that I was lucky enough to get a copy of. Folly Ado, how are you? Glad to have you on the show.
I'm excellent. It's great to be here, Pierce.
Wonderful. Well, I guess why don't we just start off? Who is Folly Ado?
As much as I can say, I'm in my mid-20s. I'm a long-haired rocker type with a dead Kennedy's tattoo. I have a formal academic art background. I studied illustration at the Delaware College of Art and Design and the Maryland Institute College of Art. I'm a graphic designer in my free time. As you said, I'm a writer and illustrator on Black Budget.
Excellent. And it is a gorgeous comic. Tell people where they can go if they want to pick up a physical copy, and at least and you have some of the comic is up online as well, right?
Well, to get a physical copy, you'd have to reach out directly to me, and that would be at Black Budget Comics with an X, by the way, at gmail.com. But if you would like to read the first issue as it is now, you can go to blackbudgetcomics.wordpress.com, and it's right there.
Excellent. And I would encourage people to get a physical copy. It's a gorgeous-looking comic. A lot of work went into it. And, of course, it's always, I mean, you've probably dealt with this yourself. I mean, I'm a big comic fan, and I kind of hate digital the digital medium for comics. Mm-hmm. I know that a lot of comics, I mean, pretty much all comics now will, you can get them in a digital format. But there's something to be said for, really kind of holding the book in your hands. Although it is rather expensive if you are, if you're reading a bunch of comics, it can be an expensive trip to the store on a Wednesday to drop, $100 or something on, a whole slew of comics. And of course, they take up tons of space. But people should definitely go and purchase a copy of Black Budget. And hopefully this episode will inspire some people to actually get a physical copy. But, I guess, Folly, let's just start from the beginning. What is Black Budget, the comic? Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, Black Budget is an ongoing anthology. Only the first issue is available at the moment, but it's erotic espionage conspiracy action. Generally, I pitch it to normal people who I meet on the street as like the Manchurian Candidate, but sexy. To your audience, I would say that it's intended as a long-form exploration into the subject of government experimentation and use of mind control via hypnosis, drugs, and psychotronics. Its goal is to meld the real undocumented with the fictitious and scantily corroborated. And I should say right away, it contains explicit, non-tasteful nudity, not safe for work.
Yes.
As far as why I got into it, I feel like there's so much out there in the, alternative media about mind control that, if you weren't a really careful student, you wouldn't know if things that are really nailed down and true are true, because there's so much fluff out there that's just hearsay or completely made up. And I feel like to put them all in the same place in an illustrated context might encourage people to look deeper, because, no one's going to take a comic book as primary source knowledge where they might read an article and say, oh, well, this is true. But if they're interested in it, they might follow up and keep looking. I guess that's my hope.
Yeah, no, totally, and I think people will definitely get that when they read Black Budget, and you really do a fantastic job of kind of blending, as you said, fact and fiction. They work so well together, and there's actually, I mean, we'll explore this later for sure, but I mean, there are even historical things that you reference or that you're sort of kind of, I don't know, using as like stand-ins for things that I wasn't even aware of. There's a lot of, like you said, real factual stuff. There's some stuff that's a little hard to corroborate. There's also just some really, wonderful, clever things. There's lots of, I guess we should say this episode will have spoilers for the entire first issue.
Certainly, yes.
So, if you'd like to, if you don't want to be spoiled yet, then, you can pause if you're listening to this in podcast format and go and get a copy of Black Budget and then read it and then listen to this. But we will be spoiling it. But there's also lots of hidden messages, I guess we could say. There's a lot of stuff in there. Folly, you were kind enough to, when you sent me the comics, you also sent me a list of all the spoilers and stuff. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later as well. Lots of really great things that were in there, stuff that I didn't even, I mean, there were some things that I knew, like, oh, that's got to be something, but there's so much interesting stuff in there. Before we kind of dive into the comic itself and also explore the sort of larger topics of mind control and stuff, let's just talk a little bit about like the actual process of making a comic book. I mean, what goes into making a comic, especially like an independent comic like this yourself? I mean, what did you have to do? And just give us like a whole kind of a breakdown from actually drawing it, all of that, to the physical, making of a book.
Well, thank you for your kind words, first of all, about how the book looks and how well it works. Thank you. As far as the process goes, of course, there is first the research phase. I'm very interested in this topic, so pretty much every second of my life I'm doing research. But as far as what the process is, in the comic book form, it's printed at a certain scale, right? But in my sketchbook, I draw it at least 2 to 3 times the scale for every panel. I do pencils first, outlines in micron, and then ultimately the black and white is done in ink wash, which is sort of like watercolor, but with ink. Different gradations of ink in water will create a darker mark successively. And the way that ultimately ends up going is that every panel takes at least 6 hours to complete. So it's a long, arduous process. And even after it's drawn, you have to scan it in, correct the levels of blacks. Maybe the paper got a little wrinkly. You got to do some Photoshop editing to fix that up, things of that nature. And once it's all drawn and edited, it goes into the phase of adding the type, which of course you have to write. And as far as the printing goes, that's been a little bit of a headache for me so far. I sell physical copies at events, punk rock flea markets, comic conventions, things of that nature. And I've gone through a couple of local print shops, and I really wasn't able to make the profit margins I wanted. I found a good online resource called Comics Wellspring that will print your stuff for you and send it to you. There are other online retailers who just won't print not safe for work stuff, which is unfortunate. But, if I can get the shipping cost down on my next print run, I think it will be a good decision.
And no, I can attest to it is, I was actually reading it at work, and a few times I had to kind of put it down when I heard some people coming into the room. But it is great. It is, for sure, it's like an erotic conspiracy thriller. Folly, what any kind of like influences in terms of comics that have influenced you, mainstream? What's your favorite mainstream comic, underground comic, things like that?
Well, I'm a little bit biased because in my art school education, almost all of my illustration teachers were European. So when they would show us comics and comic art, they would show us Euro comics. We would look at the Meta Barons written by Yarodowski. The art of that, blows my mind. I guess there were several different artists in that, and they're kind of escaping the tip of my tongue at this moment. But look up the Meta Barons published by Humanoids. That's probably my favorite. If you can call it mainstream comic, it's a Euro comic, not super mainstream here. Certainly Heavy Metal Magazine. We looked at that a lot.
Yep.
One of my favorite erotic comics illustrators is a woman named Giovanna Casotto. If I could be as good as her one day, that would be so great. People that I've went to school with, they've done some really incredible work that I always follow up with. I had a TA, one of my illustration classes, named Annie Wu, who later went on to work on the Venture Brothers cartoon. She did a whole series there was a Black Canary reboot where she's sort of the lead singer in like a Riot Girl band. That's really incredible. Check her out. Things of that nature.
Excellent. Well, and I think a lot of that will come across in the, and there are also, I mean, there's like at least 2 references in the first issue to like heavy metal bands in particular. And I was listening to those yesterday, and we'll definitely link up to that in the show notes as well. People should check them out. I think it's Pentagram and Electric Wizard are the 2 bands. The Pentagram song is awesome. And Electric Wizard is it's like sort of, it reminds me a bit of like Sleep.
Exactly.
Kind of like stoner metal. Yeah, for sure. Fantastic. I guess maybe before we kind of explore the book itself, why don't we kind of just sort of set the stage in terms of the type of the subject matter, the research that goes into this? Because as you say, and we've spoken about this before in emails and stuff, exploring the subject of mind control, exploring MK Ultra, and some of the I don't know, fallacies that are inherent in this kind of research. There's a lot of there's a lot of stuff out there on MK Ultra. A lot of it can be kind of, questionable or problematic. And then, of course, I mean, there is a lot that's well documented. So why don't we kind of talk about the type of research that went into this? I mean, what were you interested in? Because there definitely seems to be a you're playing up on the idea of the Monarch program, which again there's no like real documentable proof that this existed. This, I mean, at least to me, my own opinion, it kind of strikes me as something that has just sort of permeated conspiracy culture to such an extent that people, if you say like, oh, that person's Monarch, it instantly you kind of know what they're talking about. But there isn't really a lot of like factual information about this. But at the same time, I mean, there's just so much, like on every page in Black Budget is full of real factual things. So why don't we kind of just talk about like your research process, Folly? I mean, where did you kind of come from? And I guess in a broad sort of a way, I mean, how do you feel about like the MK Ultra research community and things like Project Monarch?
Well, I think exactly as you said, Pierce, it's so murky and it's hard to say. I mean, you remember the first Terminator film, surely, right? Yes. There's the scene where Kyle Reese is in the police station and he's breaking it down. It's like, there's a man, surrounded by living tissue. He's a Terminator. And it's like, and the psychiatrist says, everything he's saying is self-contained. He doesn't have to provide a shred of evidence because his psychosis produces a reality for him where no evidence could possibly exist. You run into people like that all the time, especially in the MK Ultra community. Someone says, well, this happened to me. What are we supposed to do with people like that? To my mind, you might say, well, we can't take them seriously at all. This feels completely ridiculous. And that's certainly the most safe way to look at it. But you have to try and think about what are the intersections with things that we do know. What are things that, have been borne out by historical records that we can compare this against, and how similar is it? Certainly with the phenomena of Monarch mind control, it goes far beyond things like Bluebird and Artichoke, which I'll talk about in a moment. The really provable experimentation that occurred, it goes even beyond that as far as what its capabilities claim to be. Mm. And as far as, a really good resource, I mean, it's not perfect, I'll say that, but it's definitely a good starting point of research. If you're looking into this, it's going to include many of the things I'm about to talk about in a few moments, is the 1979 book by Walter Boert, Operation Mind Control. As I said, not perfect, but there is a lot of content about that on the internet. You can go to archive.org and find the full PDF. Dave Emery has done a lot of great radio interview discussions about it, and if you feel like paying Amazon, it's also on Audible. So to sort of dive into the things that I'm talking about here, things that we know are true, air quotes know are true, they're in military documents that have been discovered, released, and we can discuss what the implications of them are. In the 1940s, the U.S. military was conducting experiments in hypnosis that, were they, at least in their own mind, consider them to be proven effective. Dr. Bernard C. Gindis, conducted experiments on hypnosis for delivering coded messages via courier. Essentially, a complex coded message was given to test subjects that they were unable to remember in a waking state, but they were rehypnotized and given a cue, and they were able to perfectly recall the message, and they were totally unaware of their hypnosis experience. That's in his book, New Concepts on Hypnosis, in 1979, and also reprinted in Operation Mind Control. Similarly, J.G. Watkins conducted military experiments using hypnosis that induced lethal intent into a soldier. He convinced that soldier under hypnosis that a fellow officer was a Japanese soldier and that it was kill or be killed. The test subject leaped upon his fellow officer and attempted to kill him, and that's certainly an atypical reaction for that soldier to have had. And, when we look at these things, we can say, if the military has been willing to look into these things and in their own writings determine them to be effective, they may well never admit when they've used them. They may just, it's out there, but, it didn't work, or they just wouldn't talk about it at all. And to my mind, if the intent existed, creating a hypno-program courier who also fucks, which is, sort of within the monarch narrative, is not particularly outlandish. Though many things about the monarch narrative and figures involved in it are pretty ridiculous. You read Thanks for the Memories or whatever, and there's some pretty absurd passages in it. So,
Kathy O'Brien is a lunatic, in my opinion, and a lot of what she certainly helped to popularize this idea of Project Monarch, and I think that it's sort of unfortunate because. And I might be a little off base, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but so much of the MK Ultra research community and the research that goes into it, it reminds me a lot of the ufology community. And I myself, I don't talk about UFOs really much on the show. I have done a few things in the past, and I've praised Robbie Graham's book, Silver Screen Saucers. Everyone should go and get a copy of that. I was thinking about a lot of that when I was reading Black Budget, because so much of the sort of theory that Robbie Graham posits is how much is pop culture or fiction influencing our facts. It is a fact there are UFOs out there. There are things that Air Force pilots, nearly every astronaut that NASA has sent up into space has seen something that they can't explain. So clearly they exist, but there is also there has been a concerted effort to kind of poison the well, so to speak, when it comes to the ufology movement. And I kind of wonder if there isn't a degree of that at play with the MK Ultra stuff. There are people that are so, just crazy, or their theories. I mean, I've spoken about him before on the show. I don't have any respect for someone like Colin Ross, who would have us believe that everybody, our husbands and wives, our grandmothers are some kind of MK Ultra sex slave come assassin. So in that sense, I mean, that sort of influence in that kind of, I think it dissuades people a lot of the time from looking into it. And MK Ultra, by its very nature, is again a fact. The CIA was doing this. The military was clearly doing this. It does exist. I would even go so far as to say that they probably have never stopped it. And the fact that they are, again, not totally dissimilar to the UFO phenomenon, where we have, the CIA getting involved all the way back in the late 40s, 50s, urging, people that this was all a hoax, it's stupid, don't look into this, and inserting people into the ufology community. The fact that the CIA and others have been so upfront about discrediting anybody that looks into mind control and, it could never happen, it is a little suspicious. And if we kind of even pull back a little bit more, again, just looking at I've studied undue influence, cult groups, high control groups. I mean, that is the simplest form of mind control. And it's interesting when you were talking there about some of the Pentagon's own experiments in this, and J.G. Watkins doing these experiments, convincing someone that a fellow officer was a Japanese soldier and kill or be killed. I mean, just on a basic level, I mean, the Pentagon does that to every recruit that they get.
Well, yes.
If you're either with us or against us. You're a terrorist or you're our butt. So they kind of do that on a very basic level, and we can certainly call that mind control. They are controlling people's perceptions and things like that. And again, there clearly is documentation on this. We can even look. I mean, I haven't seen it, but it has even broken into the mainstream. There was the Errol Morris. Wormwood,
yes.
Sort of a docudrama about Frank Olson. And that's pretty much accepted, even in the mainstream press, that the CIA helped to kill Frank Olson because of information that he had, not even necessarily regarding mind control, but he was involved in that whole process, and he was most likely dosed with LSD at some point, and was helped out of a. What was it? The 23rd story of a building here in New York City,
with a blow to the back of the head, certainly.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, with a blow to the back of the head. So it does exist. Folly, quickly. I mean, anything just sort of on the sort of along the lines of what I was saying. I mean, the kind of poisoning that goes on in this community.
No, I think that you've really hit the nail on the head. The fact is there are people who consume this information actively and who are just instantly credulous. Like, they read something or they see, oh, look at this poster where one person is covering like their eye. That's inherently a symbolism of monarch, and it's like it's perpetuating this, totally unproven notion that, that every single Hollywood celebrity is like, mind controlled for boning, I guess, or whatever. It's just. What's that guy? Vigilant Citizen. I think if you go to that guy's website, every single thing.
Oh yeah,
it's exactly like that.
Every pop star is a monarch agent, or certainly every pop star that worked for Disney. Have you, Folly? Have you ever looked into what's her name? I think Candy Jones.
Yeah. So it's really hard to get the actual book, The Control of Candy Jones. Now, I mean, it's really old and not in print, and I haven't found it online. But there are excerpts in Operation Mind Control. I mean, it's interesting, but the fact is it's also really difficult to find photos of her as an alleged pinup girl in the World War II era. You can find a lot of other people, but not her. I mean, I find that interesting that,
Yes, no, I have I've heard that too, that, there's speculation that she wasn't really a pinup girl. I bring it up only because Candy Jones, the reason we know about her is, of course, because she was married to a great radio personality, Long John Nebel, who is very much kind of like a proto-conspiracy theorist, late night. There wouldn't be an Art Bell without someone like Long John Nebel, who and he did like a midnight radio show, and he would have a lot of UFO type, abductees and things like that. It was Nebel who I guess put forth this notion that Candy Jones was some kind of a mind-controlled victim, so to speak. So it's just interesting, again, that this is coming, again, from that conspiracy world. And you kind of have to wonder, what was going on there. I see Chuck in the chat room saying that Long John was a wild man. He certainly was. And just while we're on the topic of Long John Nebel, just a big shout-out to probably the biggest radio personality that has influenced my life, Gene Shepard, who used to also be on Long John Nebel's show quite a bit. But anyway, kind of refocusing the conversation. I guess when do we start to kind of explore the book itself and the themes that are present in this, and we'll talk about the book and again how that kind of translates to the larger topics that we're talking about. And I guess why don't you just give us like why don't we start with just sort of a brief thumbnail of what happens in the first issue of Black Budget?
Absolutely. So as we say, it is involving the alleged monarch mind control. It's a one-shot. Its subject is Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. It focuses on Operation Infinite Reach, which was a series of missile strikes the U.S. carried out in 1998, particularly the strike on the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Sudan. It serves as sort of a baseline. If one were to tightly condense the monarch narrative as a short opening paragraph to a longer explanation, that would be issue 1.
Excellent. And again, there's so much to unpack just in this first issue. Because again, I mean, all of what you're talking about, for the most part, is factually correct. There was as you say, Infinite Reach, this military or a series of military strikes in Afghanistan and also in Sudan that destroyed the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory, bombed by Bill Clinton. Let's just even just quickly, because this again, it of course sort of hit me. The comic starts off with Monica Lewinsky engaged, so to speak, with Bill Clinton. We won't get into all the specifics, but it's he, I guess, sort of uses he's looking at some documents. And there's all sorts of interesting things there, including some real things. I mean, there's you have there's a little photo, and I love this too. That this is like my favorite in any kind of like sci-fi or conspiracy thriller type stuff, where you just sort of present the audience with some stuff, but you don't explain everything, and the exposition is sort of given later or not at all. So we see these documents laid out, and there's one where you see these chimpanzees with some kind of electrodes or something connected to their brain, which is from a real photo, right? This is like
yes.
Jose Delgado,
Mm-hmm.
who did experiment on primates and I think even wanted to do it on people, right?
He did do it on people eventually, but yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, and he believed that we could control people's emotions and thought patterns through the use of like electrical impulses directly to their brain.
Mm-hmm. That if you put some sort of an electrical stimulator in the right part of the brain, it would trigger either an emotional response or a pattern of behavior.
Right, and not to get too off topic, but I think Delgado at one point, thought he proposed this as like a way to make workers work longer hours and not complain. So it's sort of a psychotic, uber capitalist idea, I guess, in that sense. Just have them work endlessly and never complain. You also, we see some other photos, obviously, of the Al-Shifa Pharmaceutical Center. There's also like the chemical component for scopolamine, which is a very powerful hallucinogenic drug, which is, I think that's like Colombian devil's breath, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And this is this sort of like mythical, it's not mythical, I mean, it does exist, but supposedly you can, if you make scopolamine powder, you can basically blow it in someone's face, and if they inhale it, they become your mind control victim. And there was like sort of like a weird panic that was started by none other than Vice magazine.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. There's some kind of Vice video about all that, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's where I first heard about it, like in college. And everyone was like, freaked. It was like, oh, damn, never go to Colombia. Someone will just walk up and, blow some dust in your face. And I don't know quite how realistic that actually was. I know that later it made its way into like a Law and Order SVU episode, and it has sort of taken on this like mythical, or status in conspiracy culture. But scopolamine is real, and as far as I know, you can basically dose someone with it and make them do things. But anyway, we see Bill Clinton looking at this stuff, and then of course he uses a particular phrase that triggers poor Monica, who then begins to explain exactly what's going on, why Bill has to bomb the Al-Shifa Pharmaceutical Center. And she goes through this whole thing about why don't you explain a little bit, Folly?
Yeah, of course. When she is given a triggering code phase, she has sort of a pseudo-psychedelic experience that is recounting to her implanted memories or information, courier message that she's instructed to give to Bill Clinton by some mysterious figures. And the nature of the message is that there are militants in the north of Sudan who are encroaching on the city of Khartoum. The United Nations has deployed peacekeeping forces to counter them, and they're converging on the city, and if the UN gets to Khartoum, they may discover the secret activity that is happening at the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant, and as such, it must be destroyed before they can discover it.
Excellent. And that's more or less where the where the first issue kind of leaves off. And there's some great shots of, these like cruise missiles, being fired from an aircraft carrier. Obviously some, phallic imagery, at play there. And then there's this wonderful, I believe that's like the direct quote from Clinton's speech, right? About,
it is, yes.
They are the terrorists and, we're gonna stop them and blah, blah, blah. But, again, it's I'm so glad that you picked that as the kind of starting point, because again, and this is what you do so well throughout the comic book, is again blending kind of fact and fiction. Even that, the actual Al-Shifa bombing, there's so much more to that alone. This was, I believe it was 3 days, like it starts off on August 20th, 1998, that's how the comic is introduced to us. That was the day that Bill Clinton ordered this bombing as far as we know, it was just a pharmaceutical factory. Mm-hmm. There was no Viet's gas being produced there. There was no real link to bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. And this was, in fact, 3 days after Clinton had testified about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And this was also oddly, and we can debate this as much as we want to, but this was also oddly after Wag the Dog had been released as the film, which again depicts a Bill Clinton-like president inventing a war with Albania to distract from a sex scandal. And I mean, everybody, Democrats and Republicans alike, believed that Bill Clinton was in fact launching this to distract. And he did this like multiple times as well. Every time the Lewinsky scandal was reaching sort of like a climax, there would be some kind of military action, against Al-Qaeda or someone else. And it was, believed that this was, to basically distract away. And just anything on that, Folly? I mean, because again, there's so many layers to that. Have you seen Wag the Dog?
I've heard you and Robbie talk about it, but I haven't seen it, no.
Oh, well, you should totally see it, because again, there's so much, like even that, I mean, like fact and fiction. And like the term Wag the Dog has sort of, again, that has sort of entered popular culture. It's almost become a meme, so to speak. And you can kind of use you can say, oh, that's a Wag the Dog moment. And so yeah, it was just I love that that's where we started. Because again, there's so much kind of fact and fiction woven into that already. Was Bill Clinton doing this was he creating, reasons to bomb places? And just a slightly off topic though, it's connected, but speaking about the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical, because I mean, I'm going to say, I don't think that it was necessarily a site for mind control. But we will talk about what the sort of analogy or what Al-Shifa is sort of standing in for a little bit later. But I mean, what do you make of just the Bill Clinton bombing the Al-Shifa Pharmaceutical Center at the height of his sex scandal? And what do you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that in the show notes for this episode, there will be a New York Times article that specifies American officials have admitted that there was no evidence that it was Osama bin Laden linked or was storing nerve gas. So we're not just talking out of our asses here. Certainly the timing of the operation gets presidential dick and hot intern's mouth off of the front pages of the news. And that's something we need to question, the nature of the timing. But I think that, why was that target chosen? I think personally that I believe Michael Parenti's explanation of the event. A target like Al-Shifa might have been chosen as a punitive strike against developing nations, being self-sufficient in an area like pharmaceuticals, not being beholden to multinational business interests to be able to provide medicines cheaply to their population. It doesn't strike me as all that different than the now declassified military and CIA operations in South America on behalf of the United Fruit Company to maintain their business stake in the region. That's my take as spoken by Parenti, I guess.
No, yeah, and I would tend to believe that as well. And of course, the relations with Sudan were strained at the time. I mean, bin Laden was living in Sudan.
Yeah, he was.
And certainly that was at the behest of the religious powers that were ostensibly in control of Sudanese politics. But then it kind of enters into the question of, well, how much did the CIA know about this? Were they allowing bin Laden to kind of operate openly in Sudan? A lot of the, testimony and anecdotes that we hear about bin Laden's time in Sudan, he had very few bodyguards. It wasn't as if he was living in, a heavily guarded compound. They could have gotten him at any time. And even more so, I mean, why didn't they just target bin Laden, instead of al-Shifa? But, I do tend to agree with you with Michael Parenti's assertion that this was also about damaging Sudan. This was about making them dependent on Western food aid or medicine and stuff like that. And also, just to make sure that they would never become kind of self-sufficient. And it's interesting, Sudan is back in the news again today. I don't know if you've been following the political situation there, but it is it is fast deteriorating, and it seems to be kind of reliving the cycle of kind of violence. And the coup that did oust Omar al-Bashir doesn't, it basically seems like it's just going to be replaced with another military dictatorship that is close with Saudi Arabia and the U.S. So interesting how these things just kind of repeat themselves. But I guess let's kind of flesh out a little bit specifically in the comic book. Some of the things that are at play here, like for instance this uttering a phrase. Now, how real is this, Folly? I mean, is this something that is this kind of fact or fiction? I mean, the only other sort of example of this that I can recall easily is the allegations of Sirhan.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yes.
That a phrase was uttered to him. This is something that he admitted later after RFK's murder, albeit under hypnosis. So, I'm a little hesitant to completely rule that as fact. But there, what's the story about the girl in the polka dot dress, right?
Right. I mean, Sirhan alleges that he would be put into something he referred to as range mode, where he believed he was at a target range and would begin shooting as if there were no human lives at stake, just from the sight of a woman in a polka dot dress, as he was trained to do, he claims. As far as the validity of that, I can't 100% speak to it, but I know that there is passages in Operation Mind Control that talk about repeated hypnotic induction of subjects becoming easier and easier and easier as they are continually trained for that purpose, that it might take a certain amount of time in the first instance, less time in the second, that in theory it could be something as simple as a phrase or some imagery that could set someone off. I might think. I don't know.
Yeah, and it does. Again, the Sirhan stuff. It does seem to be somewhat true. And again, though, and this is like the kind of complicated aspect of this is that while that might seem fairly far-fetched, right? Again, I mean, there are people that are suffering from all sorts of undue influence, if you tell them to go do something, they will go and do it. Now, is that quite the same as what Sirhan was talking about? I don't know. But, certainly if you look at things like child soldiers, it's not all that dissimilar. So it's a complicated subject to kind of get into. I guess, Folly, I mean, how do you feel about kind of the concept of kind of blending the two? Because again, it kind of strikes me as that sort of like hyper reality, and it's hard to kind of like parse through that. So how do you what do you feel about it in terms of like a medium?
I'm sorry. Could you rephrase that question? I don't know what you mean.
Well, I guess how do you feel about the kind of blending of fact and fiction in a piece of art? Does it work? Does it not work? Is it confusing people? What do you think of it?
Well, I feel that, when a piece of art tries to be 100% didactic, almost like an IKEA instruction manual, it's a little bit insulting to the viewer that, one of the things that art can allow you to do is bridge that gap with what someone means. Like, they make you feel a certain way, present you with imagery that leads you to a conclusion without, just saying like step by step, here's what the facts are. I think that's why I'm making a comic book rather than, writing articles or writing just a book. I think that, the room that visual art gives you to play with those things, and, I feel that it's essential to the conspiracy community, the alternative media community, whatever you want to call it, because, as I said, there are so many people out there who are just instantly credulous. Like, you're looking on YouTube at the secret space program, and a dude's like, yeah, I've been to Mars. And people are like, all right. It's like, I feel that some sort of remedy needs to be introduced. And not that I'm saying I'm going to save the world or whatever, but that, to be upfront about the fact that if you want to know more, you need to look to see what is true and not true, and that being one of the primary messages of my comic content. I feel like that's important to me.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I don't want you to think I was putting you on the spot there or anything. I think it really does work, and I think that in a lot of ways, using something like that fiction, I think you will attract more people. You will get more people interested. People will be more willing to kind of explore these ideas, so to speak. And I think it's also it's a clever way of educating people as well. And at the same time too, I mean, it is just it's a comic book too. It's meant to be enjoyed. It's meant to be fun.
Exactly, lighthearted.
Yes, exactly. Right, totally. But, at the same time though, I think that you do stuff a little bit different in this I don't know, like presentation, let's say, of MK Ultra mind control. I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that like Monica Lewinsky in this seems to actually be not necessarily in charge, so to speak, but she seems to be kind of like above Clinton. She actually knows what's going on. Right. Whereas Clinton is just kind of seen as like a dundering idiot who needs to basically, he is just in a position of power to be told what to do. And clearly, sex is the easiest way to convince him of something. And I found that is like an interesting narrative because again, there is like a creepy undercurrent. Again, this relates directly to people like Colin Ross of like infantilizing women. When it comes to mind control, conspiracy culture stuff, women are generally just seen as these empty vessels, where, they're turned into sex slave assassins. And, I find that really kind of disturbing. And I think that in the book, you kind of like change that narrative a little bit. And I kind of can't wait. I mean, this is like my own speculation, but there was a few panels where Monica is, I guess, kind of like talking about what's going on at the Al Shifa Pharmaceutical Center and factory and whatnot. And I don't know. I'm hoping that at some point Monica Lewinsky appears later, maybe kind of tries to break free of her mind control. I mean, she seemed to know a little bit more than meets the eye. I don't know. That might be, just sort of speculation on my half. But I hope that happens later.
There's something I'm really glad that you picked up on, Pierce, because I guess it's on page 8, where, it's the same page talking about the redacted militants. When it's Lewinsky telling Clinton what the deal is, he has like the dopiest look on his face. And that was absolutely my intention, to be like, this guy is just like a fool getting his dick sucked and he's getting told what to do. That this is not the nature of showing the nature of power is like this man thinks that he's, the leader of the free world, but, he's nothing of the sort.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's also, again, that's a great comment on so many presidents. They are just sort of vessels for much more complex interests. I think that's, again, is actually a very factual assertion. That's something that you can really kind of, hone in on, so to speak. And that seems to just be kind of like a pattern. I mean, these guys don't like someone like Clinton, whose own history as a sexual predator, it was so well known before he got into office. I mean, it kind of makes you wonder, like how did he get there? Who allowed him to kind of sit in the most powerful seat in the world, knowing that he is basically like kind of a weak guy, who could get into really compromising positions.
That you'd always have something over him, you know.
Yeah, no, of course, and certainly there's a lot to have over good old Bill. We're about 10 minutes out from the first hour, and I hope you can stick around for at least a portion of the second hour, Folly, because there's a bit more that I want to kind of explore, particularly when it comes to what Al-Shifa is kind of standing in for. And this is a really interesting point in history, and I think there's a lot of things that we can kind of unpack there. But I guess, in terms of kind of wrapping it up in this first hour, I mean, in terms of the kind of like the research, the stuff that you're talking about, what do you want people to kind of take away from this sort of first read or the first issue of this?
And that's a very good question. I think that I think most people, at least that I sold it to thus far at events, they have very little idea of what any of this is. I feel like exposing people, who are completely unfamiliar with this content at the very least is a victory. But those who are a little more involved in the community, more discerning, I guess, as I stated before, my goal for them is to be willing to look deeper than perhaps they do now, because when things are laid out so sound like a fool. Everyone in this community feels like they have an authoritative voice.
Yes.
And you read and listen to them with the intent that you're getting the truth, TM. And the nature of that I find very destructive. I think that to make something that's engaging someone in a way that makes them question it further, because ultimately I'm not the final arbitrator whether Monarch is real. You need to look for yourself, but I'm hopefully giving you the tools to do that by giving you the interest, first of all, but pointing you towards some things that will allow you to know more.
No, and I hope that people get that with the first issue of Black Budget, because I think this is it's a topic, the MK Ultra stuff, the mind control thing. It's a topic that I used to be much more not really interested. I mean, I'm still interested in it, but it was something that I devoted a lot more time to. And I have actually found myself kind of shifting away from it because there's so many kind of crazy voices in the room. And it makes it really kind of difficult. And you're spot on with the authoritative voice that so many in the conspiracy culture have. And that's just, a much larger problem. And because, too, they will say things like, Project Monarch and, Britney Spears is a, Monarch victim and, so's Justin Timberlake and all these other people. And, it kind of just becomes like accepted as fact, sadly. And there's really no basis for it. And it kind of distracts from like real instances of mind control, which, as we kind of talked about in the very beginning of the hour, I mean, that happens on a daily basis. People are in all sorts of relationships with individuals or groups where they are, for all intents and purposes, a mind control victim. They're being told to do things that they wouldn't normally do, and they're doing it, without hesitation, because of undue influence and a whole myriad of other factors. So I hope that people are, interested in exploring this a bit more. And hopefully in the second hour, we can kind of expand this out a little bit and talk about, and as I said, an incident that I was actually wholly unaware of this during the Grenada invasion. So we'll kind of continue that in the second hour. Folly Ado, please remind the listeners where they can go if they want to get a copy of the comic book, if they want to read it online, and also where can they go to follow your work?
Well, thank you, Pierce. If the things we've discussed thus far are interesting to you, if if you want to actually see the drawings, you can go to Black Budget Comics. That's comics with an X. .wordpress.com. The first issue's up there. If you would like to reach out to me to purchase a physical copy of that, my email is blackbudgetcomics@gmail.com. If you'd like to follow me periodically on social media, I am on Instagram at black_budget and on Twitter at comicsblack.
Excellent. And again, highly encourage everybody to check that out. This will all, of course, be in the show notes. Definitely people should get a physical copy. It's as I said, it's a gorgeous comic. It's well worth having. It just looks fantastic. Great drawings. I like the black and white too. There's I don't know. Sometimes I feel like people don't appreciate black and white comics anymore. You do a really tremendous job there. So yeah, please check out Black Budget. Please stick around in the second hour. We are going to expand this conversation, talk about maybe some historical incidents that may be known or unknown, and kind of unpack this a little bit more. So please stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these commercial breaks.
Straight out of the subway in New York City. Yeah, baby. The radio show that never sleeps. Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
Reminder that this is the Voice of America broadcasting worldwide.
Transistor Radio.
Morning, morning, morning. Uncle, the podcast.
The Ocelli Effect.
Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
On Ocelli.com.
You're listening to Ocelli.com Radio Network, the alternative's alternative and home of the Ocelli Effect. WallStreetWindow.com. Gold, silver, the stock market. WallStreetWindow.com. The brilliant author of The War State brings you exclusive reports about the big changes upcoming in the markets. WallStreetWindow.com.
Perhaps you're invested deeply.
Perhaps you're not in deep enough. Maybe you're thinking about getting started. WallStreetWindow.com. Michael Swanson, the brilliant author of The War State, understood these trends professionally for many years, and now he gives you the benefit of his knowledge. WallStreetWindow.com. Go there now. Go there now. Go there now.
Hump to the hump to the hump to the mayor. Hump to the hump to the hump to the mayor. Hump to the hump to the hump to the mayor. Hey, Magoria. 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 Hey, Magoria.
News, entertainment, and more. You will learn something, children's. Ocelli.com.
Now back to the man, Pierce Redman.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redman. You are, if you are tuning in here for the second hour at Ocelli.com, we are speaking with Folly Ado, who is the illustrator and author of Black Budget, which is a fantastic comic, which I highly encourage people to get a physical copy of. If not, read it online. You can find that at blackbudgetcomics.com. Or is it .wordpress.com?
.wordpress.com, and we should specify comics with an X. No,
yes.
Yeah.
So it is Black Budget and then comics, COMIX.wordpress.com. You can see the first issue there. You can also, there's contact information if you'd like to, get a physical copy. Definitely worth getting the physical copy. It looks great. The ink wash is fantastic. And we were talking about the larger topics at play in Black Budget, mind control, MK Ultra, and we're going to kind of continue that, and talking about some historical examples and some stuff that is, I guess, sort of hidden in the comic that possibly relate to mind control, or certainly there seems to be a larger story there. But before we kind of jump into that. Let's talk about some of the hidden stuff. This is a book that is filled with esoteric symbols, and certainly there is a lot of occult, secret information and knowledge that is present here. And maybe we'll, again, when Folly sent me the comic, he also included a list of spoilers and stuff like that. Explaining everything. So this will be full of spoilers, but maybe we'll just kind of start from the very beginning. Page 3, panel 1. We've got these wonderful curtains behind Bill, and one is black and one is white. And what is this a reference to?
Well, before we jump right into that, Pierce, I would like to just say a little bit about the hidden messages, if that's all right.
Please, yeah.
I feel that because I'm working in a visual medium, I have a unique opportunity to put, sources cited and, further reading material couched in the visual language. Oftentimes you get to the bottom of the page, it's like footnote, source, this dude in this book, whatever year, and you're like, okay, and you forget about it, you don't look into it, and that's a problem in our community. I feel that because I'm working in a visual medium, those who want to look deeper can just look at the image and maybe find some more things to look into. So on page 3, panel 1, as Pierce said, there are curtains to the left of right and Bill and Monica. One on the left is dark, one on the right is white. This is a reference to the two temples on the facade of Solomon's, two pillars on the the two pillars on the temple of Solomon, the facade, Yakin and Boaz. Boaz and Yakin, rather, because Boaz is on the left and is black. And these represent, in Freemasonry, the gates to hidden knowledge. You pass through them in a Freemasonic temple in rituals. It's Boaz on the left, Yakin on the right, therefore BJ. So it's esoteric and a dick joke.
Yeah, which is great. I think that's a wonderful way. And I hope that also illustrates to the listeners that, this is also, we're having fun with this, and I think you're having fun talking about this. And, not everything in conspiracy culture, even like, art and things like that have to be taken so serious. Everyone is so serious nowadays. And it was refreshing to see something, like you say, a dick joke kind of thrown in there as well. Now let's talk about, in the triggering code phrase that is used on Monica Lewinsky. It's a quote, "You're going to be my queen. A king always knows what he means." What is this a reference to?
Well, this is a lyric from a song in the 70s by a rock band called Pentagram. The song is called You're Gonna Be My Queen, I think. No, Forever My Queen. It's Forever My Queen.
Yeah.
And the imagery of the band frequently reference Luciferianism and Satanism, so it's a veiled reference to satanic ritual abuse. This is her triggering code phrase.
And maybe just explain to the listeners a little bit like who Pentagram are, because I was sort of unaware of them.
I guess I don't know how much there is to say. They're a rock band from the 70s. They're heavy metal influence. I believe they're heavily involved with the satanic community and Anton LaVey and things of that nature. I don't quite know myself.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, maybe Chuck later could chime in if he knows anything about pentagram. Chuck is definitely a heavy metal historian, so to speak. So then next we have some binary code, and we see this as sort of like a picture of Monica, and then there's like binary code kind of behind her. And this was like, I knew when I saw this one, I knew, oh, there's got to be something to this. But I don't read binary. So I guess explain what is the binary code?
So in the printed copy that you have, it's very, very faint. I'm surprised that you even saw it at all at a first glance. Yeah, to the left and right of her after she receives the code phrase, there is some code, and it is binary, as you said. You have to read it in a certain way and type it into a decoder in a certain way for it to be effective. But if you go line by line, top left line to top right line, and so on and so forth, it will resolve to an archive.org link for the 1979 book, Operation Mind Control, that we've been discussing earlier in the broadcast. And that's sort of my way of giving you an interesting source to look into further, but only if you are interested in doing that. If someone sees that, it's like, oh, some numbers. They maybe can't be reached, even if I did put a real source in there,
Yeah, and I hope, too, that this won't, like, dissuade people from, like, I assume in future, comics, in the Black Budget series, there will be tons of these little messages in there. And Foley and I don't want to, like, dissuade people from, like, looking this up in the future. I think that's another thing, too, where you're not just sort of, like, presenting, like, here's the information, like, this is the absolute fact. I mean, you kind of have to do a little bit of work. You have to, like, look into these things. You have to figure out these puzzles. And I think that's just, like, so much of what good research is about, is kind of deciphering these puzzles, trying to fit them together. And, that actually takes effort, not just, not the effort that it takes to watch, a YouTube video about the secret space program, and someone claiming, they've been to Mars or whatever. So there's more to it. Then we also see a rose, like I don't know, maybe like stained glass or something like that. That's on, I believe it's like on the Oval Office desk, right?
Yes, it's on the Oval Office desk and in the scene with the masked figures as well. The rose window, the stained glass window, in fact, the rose window in the book is modeled off of the just recently destroyed rose window in the Chapel of Notre Dame. The Rosicrucian Order is a secret society from the Middle Ages, and they symbolize their order with rose-based imagery, rose-based Christian imagery, like the rose window. In Kathy O'Brien's book, Transformation of America, she refers to the secret inner ring of her abuse network as the Order of the Rose. So that is sort of a coded, reference to her content. If it's going to be a secret group, let's symbolize something that recognizes a certain group of individuals.
And just, on the subject of Kathy O'Brien, we mentioned her before. I mean, what do you make of her? Do you think she's just totally full of it, or? That's my opinion.
Here's how I look at it. If she was what she purported to be, how could she do a 30-year speaking tour and book signing deal out of it? Like, okay,
right, yeah.
So you're basically like the most wanted like lady in history because you have all the secrets about all the things. But like next week I'll be in Toronto signing some books. Like, okay, dude.
Right, yeah, exactly, yeah. I mean, well, right. I mean, people like that. If they, you could look at Gary Webb and others. Who's the guy that wrote Danny Casolaro? Mm-hmm. I mean, those people don't last all that long. Whether they're driven to kill themselves or they, are meant to look like they kill themselves. Those people don't last all that long if you have real information. Michael Hastings, another Mike one, Rupert. Most likely. Yeah, maybe even Mike Rupert. Yeah, exactly. The fact that Kathy O'Brien is still around and presumably like still doing things should speak volumes to that. Also, kind of related to the Candy Jones thing. I don't know because I just don't really care enough. But who is the guy that was always with Kathy O'Brien that claimed to have like unopened these hidden passageways?
Yeah, Mark Phillips. There's always sort of a strange, protector role, and whenever one of these women come forward, there's the person who rescued them or is now their sort of, ex-government insider who's, letting her tell her story. And, even in that narrative, if it's exactly what they purport it to be, you're some sort of CIA man, you see a mind-controlled slave lady, and you're like, damn, I gotta wife that. Let's go on the speaking tour. Okay, so let's say and give you the benefit of the doubt. What's up with that, dude?
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's some, creepy dude who comes out of nowhere. And marries them or is obviously using them. For financial gain.
That's a curious thing, the handler role. Now, you kind of invited me in on part of this.
Yeah, please, Chuck, jump in.
I needed to refresh myself because I knew that Pentagram had existed for a long time. I didn't realize their first release goes back to 1972. And here's the thing. It's fascinating to me what has survived into the digital age and what has not. And I bet that your guest could also relate to this as well. Now, it's kind of funny because it makes perfect sense with the MK Ultra stuff and the concept of the mind control person and the handler. There's always somebody who shepherds these things forward. And the same thing is true about some of this, iconography that's connected to heavy metal music. There is a ton of the underground, right? That never survived into the digital age. Some of it I know firsthand because I was there, as a musician, right? And some of it did, and it often seems like there's something behind it, making sure that you get to see something as, to the nose as Pentagram is. Of course, they only made news again not too long ago when their singer wound up getting locked up, I think, for elder abuse or something like that.
I think he beat up his mom while he was on crack, is what I heard.
Something like that, yeah. And I didn't want to go that blatant, but yeah, that's about where it goes. But these are the charges, and he wound up, being guilty of something and going away. And there's a lot to be said about that. A lot of these people end up getting, sort of undermined. You notice some of the people that were part of the punk or metal underground, wind up in these situations with the law later on. They reemerge. It's really a fascinating thing to dig into as a subculture. So I really find it fascinating that he's blended that subculture together with this other subculture, which is, look, here's a mind control victim. Of course, there's a handler, protector, sort of person here. And it's really always these very weird stories. Where, they rescued them, they're now, husband and wife, or they were boyfriend and girlfriend, or, as something goes on where there's a real intimacy to it, which apparently is, one of the easiest access points for higher levels of control, obviously. I mean, look, when you take a look at the most relatable and common ways of controlling an individual, abusive relationships are everywhere. Throw a stone no matter where you're sitting, right? It's kind of fascinating that, that all of this sort of converges together into this stew where it's difficult to separate fact from fiction. So the idea that he's created this really in-depth piece of art, which I think addresses all of this one way or another, is really fascinating and so sophisticated, man. It's almost like I would like a peek inside of your brain for a little while, brother, because you're thinking on a lot of different levels, and you're producing a really amazing product. And full disclosure, I told him during the break, and I've said this somewhere else. The only critique I have is you don't need to keep heels on the woman in every panel. So that's it. Other than that, this is a disturbing and equally informative and thought-provoking piece of art, man. I love it personally. And so with that, I'm going to drop out. But I urge people to take a look at some of these icons of music and imagery that are tied to esoteric subjects, because it seems like they are given kind of a lane in the internet reality to continue to exist, even if they've been around for 40 years. it's kind of fascinating, and Pentagram is an example of that. So I found it interesting that you went with a reference like that, but then again, a guy who would have a Dead Kennedys tattoo might go that way, and also love Jell-O and all that too, by the way. But that's it, man. I wanted to just throw that in for you since you kind of called upon me.
Sure, and I might a little bit later. I might call on you once more, Chuck, because there's something that we might need your opinion on that we'll discuss a bit later. But back to some of the spoilers. We kind of talked about this already, Folly, but we'll just sort of go over it again because again, there's so much on every single panel. There are the photographs in front of Bill that are, I think, at the beginning and towards the end. What's on these photos?
Yes, I suppose we discussed this a little bit earlier, but as you said, I do try to have at least something hidden on every page for an astute reader to look more into. Part of the reason for that is because you can read a couple dozen page comic book in 2 minutes, but it can take 200 hours to draw. So I try to layer in the things to keep you looking. On the presidential desk, there are 4 photographs that are visible and readable. One is the chemical formula for the drug scopolamine. Another is a drawing of a photograph taken during Jose Delgado's research on monkeys via direct energy stimulation to the brain. 2 others are drawings loosely based on the photo of Delgado's stymoceiver, which is the electrical brain implant he developed. And the final one is the proposed location of the stymoceiver in the brain in an academic treatise I was able to find.
Yeah, and which is horrifying to imagine that he was going to put that in somebody's head. And I mean, what a lunatic Delgado was. People should really look him up, even if it's just like his Wikipedia page. It's pretty disturbing. Then we move on to page 10, which I guess is a little bit more of a fiction. But it was, even I noticed this one also. But part of the NASA logo is cut off, and I believe this is supposed to be at the clandestine mind control, center at Al Shifa. And what is the? I didn't even really know that, but what is this a vague allusion to?
Well, I believe in both Transformation of America and Thanks for the Memories. Kathy O'Brien and Royce Taylor always seem to assert that NASA had direct involvement, either in terms of technology or personnel, ex-Nazis or whatever, that were involved in their mind control abuse.
Which is just why? What would they have to gain from any of this? I just don't even understand how NASA enters in, but there we go. Then later we have and I guess actually this one I knew it was something, but this is just my shocking lack of art history knowledge. I couldn't quite piece it together, but there is one of the panels is sort of like a representation of a Rembrandt painting, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, right?
I believe that's how you say it.
Yeah. And why did you choose that?
Well, I mean, it's sort of like that painting represents, this is the apex of anatomical knowledge that not only the artist has, but these men being depicted have. This man can dissect a human being and understand what all the nerves and muscles do, and that's supposed to illustrate the crowning achievement of Dutch society at that time, that they had men who could do that. And that's what I'm sort of trying to get to with the figurative reference, is that these men, similarly, these scientists, have unlocked something very, very powerful within the human psyche and anatomy.
Excellent. And then finally, and I think it's actually on the same page, but it's the second panel. There is there's a large computer, and there are different, I guess, little buttons. Some of them are lit up and some of them aren't. And this actually is, you can read this as Braille. And what does this actually read out?
So there are 2 things on the page you're discussing.
Yes,
computer,
you're right.
There are 4 discs with some dots in them. Those dots, as some may know, Braille is represented in 6 dots arranged in 2 vertical columns. Those who are raised may be represented as black, or not raised to be not drawn or white if they were represented graphically. If you read the 4 discs, it spells R-E-A-D in Braille, which is sort of a clue to be reading what the other thing on the computer is. And that is, there are a series of lights on the computer. Each row of lights has 26 lights in it, with only one illuminated. And those 26 lights correspond to a letter. If you put them together, it spells VINUM space SABBATHI, Vinum Sabbathi, which is the title of an Electric Wizard song that I interpret to be about the consequences of forbidden knowledge.
Yeah, which is that might be like my favorite hidden message. All of those, anyone where it's like you get to go and explore something that you may not have heard of, or is something new to you, is fantastic. And then on the back of the comic, is something that at first, it's all different symbols. But it is like a real back cover, and you are, talking directly to the reader. I don't know. Do you have like the translation up in front of you, Folly?
I can read some of it just offhand because I remember spending hours doing it. But I do have the translation as well.
Yeah, so you want to, you don't even have to go through the whole thing. Maybe it might be more interesting for people to kind of decipher it. But you reference, you thank the reader, obviously. And then you talk about the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant and the cruise missile strike as a stand-in for an incident that happened back in 1983 when the U.S. invaded Grenada. And this is something that I was unaware of, and maybe we can kind of just pick it up right from there. I guess maybe first, Folly, what happened in Grenada in 1983?
So in 1983, there was a coup that was launched by allegedly Marxist forces supported by students that held some universities hostage. The Reagan government decided to send troops in and bomb the country to quell that insurrection.
Right. And this was, what was this, like 3 days worth? And figures as to how many people died is, still being debated to an extent. But it was sort of like one of these, I guess just like a raw, America is so great. Look, they came, they went, they conquered and they left. But, there was a lot more, I think, in terms of why America went into Grenada. Obviously, the politics of the time dictated much of that. I think his name was Joseph Bishop, who was, he helped overthrow the U.S.-backed, dictator in Grenada, and was, implementing a series of radical left-wing Marxist reforms. Women's rights, labor rights, all sorts of. They were aligned with the Soviet Union and Cuba. They were trying to rebuild infrastructure to allow for tourism to kind of flourish in Grenada, in the Caribbean. And, I think this kind of pushed, Reagan and his, the people around him to go in and brutally suppress this. But like with a lot of these operations, and I'll talk a little bit later specifically about Operation Just Cause, which was the invasion of Panama, in Operation Urgent Fury, which was the invasion of Grenada. There seems to be some ulterior motives, maybe some that are a little kind of hidden. And talk about this bombing of a mental hospital by U.S. forces.
Yeah, right. During the 1983 invasion of Grenada, 18 civilians died in a supposedly accidental airstrike on a mental hospital. The U.S. claimed that it was hit by a mistake because it was too close to an anti-aircraft site they were seeking. This mental hospital, is highly suspicious. Some in the alternative research community posit that it was a site of mind control for a number of reasons. Dr. Jeffrey H. Bourne was a prominent, physician and researcher in the field of primate research, primate neurological study, as we discussed earlier with the photographs of Jose Delgado's brain chip monkeys. Primate research, and especially primate neuroscience, was a huge conduit of funding for MKUltra programs. The CIA was very interested in discovering what could be gained from researching primates, and specifically primate brains. Now, Jeffrey H. Bourne was the director of the Yerkes National Primate Research Center at Emory University from 1962 until 1978, specifically in the field of brain physiology and neuroscience. And one of his academic texts is called The Structure and Function of Nervous Tissue, Volume 5, Structure 3, and Physiology 3. The information gleaned from this primate research was of great interest to mind control. I just want to stress that. He took up his post in Grenada for the Primate Research Center. So he was operating out of that country, doing his experimentation. And there are claims within the alternative media community, I believe it's a film called Evidence of Revision, Part 5, that Dr. Jeffrey Bourne and his son, Dr. Peter Bourne, were conducting experiments in Grenada at the mental hospital when the U.S. bombed it. The use of mental health facilities as sites for MKUltra experimentation is something the government has readily admitted to at this point. Conditions similar to the hospital's bombing have been referenced in the first issue of Black Budget because ultimately the militants are encroaching on the Al-Shifa Center. There may be a discovery of the illegal activities going on there. This prompts Clinton to launch the missile strike. What I'm ultimately positing and drawing a correlation to is that a danger existed with this hostile government in Grenada, that the hospital's illegal activities and immoral human experiments, if they existed, may have been uncovered. As such, that would be the motivation for the destruction of the hospital.
And again, this is, there is actually, I think, something going on with the Grenada stuff, and I don't know, Folly, if you've like looked much into Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Obviously, there are allegations of it's not. It is a fact that Jim Jones and what's his name, Dan Mitterrand, he was a CIA agent. He seemed to have some kind of a relationship with Jim Jones dating back to, when he was out in Kansas or Nebraska. He then pops up when Jones mysteriously moves to Brazil. And there is there are obviously allegations of, maybe Jonestown was some kind of a experiment. I don't know. I can't really definitively say that, although I have looked into it at the time. But I don't know if you knew this, but there is a weird Grenada connection to Jonestown. Yeah, and maybe you can. George Philip Blakey. And there was even a weird connection between Jones and the Prime Minister of Grenada, Sir Eric Gairy, who I believe was the person who was overthrown by Joseph Bishop. But Gairy he actually visited the People's Temple in San Francisco, and he I think it was Jones invested a whole bunch of money into the Grenada National Bank at one point. And there is also in John Judge, who I'm sure everyone is familiar with, great researcher, was a great researcher, done tremendous work on all sorts of JFK, 9/11, certainly about Jonestown. The Black Hole of Guyana, which is the untold story of Jonestown, is a great, very long article that John Judge wrote. And there are numerous references to stuff going on in Grenada. There were a bunch of businessmen from Grenada that acted as kind of brokers for Jim Jones when he was in Guyana. And there is actually even in the Black Hole of Guyana, there is a reference, and I didn't even know this, to Jeffrey Bourne, the researcher in Grenada. And I'll just quote from it. So, and they're talking about the work that was going on there. And John Judge writes, quote, "The work may have included the mysterious operations of a mental hospital in Grenada that eluded government security by promising free medical care. The hospital, as operated by Sir Jeffrey Bourne, Chancellor of the St. George's University Medical School, was also staffed by his son Peter Bourne. Dr. Peter Bourne. His son's history includes work with psychological experiments and USAID in Vietnam, the methadone clinics in the U.S., and a drug scandal in the Carter White House. The mental hospital was the only structure bombed during the U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983. This was part of a plan to put Sir Eric Gairy back in power. Were additional experiments going on at the site?" So, and, John Judge is a pretty well-known, researcher, well-respected. So, I tend to put a little bit of stock into that kind of stuff. But, just fascinating. I mean, did you know about that at all?
I didn't, and you ultimately phrased it a lot better than I did. I appreciate that.
Well, I'm just reading from John Judge,
certainly.
So.
But I heard it much more down the line, and as things go with telephone in the conspiracy community, things can break down. So I'm glad that you had a lot more better primary source information to put out there. I do think that it is suspicious, as I said, because of the area of primate research being such a profound area of interest for the CIA and MKUltra funding.
Well, and even again too, and there are links in the John Judge's sources, everything. So and I'll provide links to this in the show notes. People can check it out. I mean, he has sources for his son's work in with USAID psychological experiments. I mean, that is really strange too. It's one of those things where it's just kind of like, of all the people, it's just these guys just happen to be working in Grenada. They happen to be bombed. And I guess this kind of brings me to, and this is sort of one of those aspects of this kind of research that makes it so difficult, is that, there do seem to be ulterior motives, but it's hard to kind of pinpoint it. There isn't enough research done into this, but it really reminded me, as I said, in 1980, I forget when it was, probably 1989, 1990, the Operation Urgent Fury, Operation Just Cause, the invasion of Panama. Clearly that wasn't just about getting Noriega out of power. There are lots of allegations about, money being taken out of the Panamanian Bank. There are things, like researcher and academic Matthew Alford has talked about the theory that there were videotapes secretly recorded of officials in very compromising positions that were being held at the bank that were also, had to be confiscated, and that the invasion was a pretext to that. And in the amazing film by one of my heroes, Elizabeth Montgomery, narrates it, The Panama Deception. They had firsthand witnesses, firsthand accounts of experimental weapons being used in Panama. Some gun that could saw, they sort of say it was something like a laser that kind of cut through a school bus in Panama and melted, the metal. So certainly, it just sort of reminded me of that, again, using the pretext of an invasion. And Grenada, too, again, if you look at, it was all about, that was sort of like the original kind of we're doing this for democracy. And we gotta help, safeguard the freedoms of the people of Grenada by putting in place a U.S. puppet. So I don't know, any kind of, thoughts on that? Have you looked at all at the stuff in Panama?
I've definitely seen The Panama Deception. I think it's a fantastic film. Yeah, I mean, the allegations of experimental weapons, they come up in all kinds of conflicts the U.S. is involved in. I mean, there are allegations, of course, anthrax during the Korean War, and arguably that's exactly what Frank Olson was killed to silence. I believe that's the program that he worked on. What was the other one? Oh, these microwave weapons in Iraq and Afghanistan. People describing bizarre wounds on corpses, dead corpses with no bullet wounds or concussion wave patterns or burns, things of that nature. So I think that certainly there are parallels to be drawn there that perhaps I will explore later in other comics. But beyond that, I don't have much to say now. No.
Well, also mentioning the anthrax in Korea, and I believe, that is exactly what, Frank Olson was certainly involved in that. And I think that that's a more logical explanation for his murder than the, I'm sure the Pont Saint-Esprit, which was this incident where they aerosolized LSD, apparently, and sprayed it over a village or something in France.
Right.
That did happen, but I don't believe that that's why they killed Olson. But that just sort of reminds me, and this kind of brings me around, and maybe I'll see if Chuck doesn't mind jumping in to just discuss this, and we can kind of explore it. But you mentioning Iraq and anthrax and things like that. There were also, of course, in the Gulf War, there were certainly a lot of experimental drugs that were being given to soldiers, weird, vaccines and stuff for anthrax and all sorts of other things. And this is kind of links in with the Timothy McVeigh, who was given all sorts of weird vaccines and drugs. He wrote about this to his family members at the time. It has since come out that they were, in fact, giving the soldiers all sorts of weird pharmaceuticals that they were kind of using to test them. And that, of course, then kind of brings in the whole, mind control with Timothy McVeigh and Jolyon West, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. There is some weird connection between Jolyon West and Timothy McVeigh, although nothing kind of tangential. But, Chuck,
Yeah, well, here's the thing, right, is that if we take a look at modern warfare in general, you find that there are accounts from soldiers on the ground that had been previously very easily dismissed, going all the way back to, now, a lot of people think I defend JFK all the time, but Operation Shad was a real thing. There were various things that went on during his administration that were not exactly clean and nice. You know what I mean? But every time we have one of these incursions into a foreign land, it seems like, well, time to take out the stuff we've been working on through DARPA. And when it came down to a lot of these Gulf War conflicts of recent times, you see that there are tons of accounts from individuals on the ground who tell you some fantastic stories of weapons and things that they see that they cannot explain. Now, some of it you could chalk up to, and they always used to chalk up a lot of the stuff that people described in Vietnam to, well, look, these guys are damaged, They're obviously psychologically challenged. They've been through a lot, and this is true. But when you start getting a lot of reports, and we've had access to a lot more of the veterans in recent conflicts, I'll call them, that tell us some things that, look, you can't ignore it if you got, tons of guys telling you there is weird stuff happening, being loosed in the battlefield that the mainstream media certainly doesn't want to discuss. The military doesn't want to let you know that they're live action testing things. And again, when we look back in our history, we find that, well, we shame people nowadays for using chemical warfare and biological elements. But in real terms, we utilize this stuff along with, psychic weapons of sorts, some of them being physical, electromagnetic, which do produce different results. I mean, listen, electromagnetic disturbances create reactions in the brain. So, I mean, there is a wide array of stuff that could be sampled here, and we need to take some of this very seriously. Now, is some of it the stuff of legends, and has some of it been intentionally introduced? I found it fascinating that you mentioned the UFO stuff earlier, because a lot of times you find that there seems to be intentionally introduced garbage to undermine the reality of some of the very fantastic things. If you can mix it all together into the hyperbolic concept of the conspiracy theorist, right, and you can present it as, well, it's all part of that one particular basket. I'm wondering if your guest has ever read the white paper by Cass Sunstein, and how it was laid out there that undermining conspiracy theory, if you will, is something that can be done by various methodologies, or if they're aware of the the stuff that came out as a result of the JFK Collections Act regarding the CIA and their strategy with the media and creating, for the first time, the phrase conspiracy theorist to undermine the positions of people that were really just criticizing the Warren Commission's reports and volumes, because this is a battle that's going on regarding getting at the truth, getting at the real information, getting at the rest of the story, like a guy used to say on the radio all the time. So I'm wondering about that, Pierce, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, yeah. Folly, you want to take that first?
So I've heard a lot of tell about that paper and that information. I am familiar with the concept that the CIA circulated some sort of a memo to their various media affiliates, Operation Mockingbird affiliates, that the term conspiracy theorist was to be used on critics of the Warren Commission. I mean, that was very early on. I guess that was like right in the Dave Emory days when that term was going around and people were being accused of that for the first time as someone who was skeptical of the findings of the Warren Commission and just of the government in general, that they couldn't be trusted to tell the truth or reflect statements accurately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, originally they were targeting Mark Lane and a couple of other people that had gotten a bit of traction, usually not even being able to publish their books in America, by the way, because publishing houses would be told by individuals that they would only describe as members of some government agency that it would be a bad idea for them to do so. Right. But these were literal communications. And in some cases, you had people, very much like the Mockingbird concept, already sort of embedded with the major media outlets. It was a lot easier back then, but they were already the conduits by which, these edicts could be issued. But they literally came up with a set of talking points. And it was really to counteract, believe it or not, the work of Jim Garrison, who, I'm not saying that, and this is how it does tie to Dave Emory and the likes of people like Mae Brussel and Mary Farrell and a lot of other individuals who were just asking questions, really, at the time. And trying to put to task the official story, and you wonder if the intelligence agencies have such a great amount of skin in the game that they need to exert such influence. What does that really mean? Is it about the cover-up? Is it about protecting one's own bad acts, or is it about a failure of intelligence, which is a term we wind up hearing a lot more later on, right? So it's really interesting. And again, this stuff is profoundly present throughout most major conflicts, and the accounts of individuals on the ground with weapons experimentation, whether it be microwave, exotic guns like Pierce was describing. I mean, that's not the only place we heard about lasers. We heard about things coming from seemingly nowhere in Iraq and splitting tanks in half. Something that, according to standard munitions, even with the depleted uranium, we couldn't quite accomplish so easily, but somehow there was something at play there. Weather manipulation in Vietnam. I mean, it goes across the board here. The exotic weaponry, if you will, that has been revealed one way or another through all this. And again, I find it really, really refreshing that he sort of ties all this together in the comic book. So, again, sorry to add these things in, but it's just an amazing landscape that you're kind of tying down to representing in this one piece of art. So far, I mean, obviously there's going to be more. I can't wait to see what comes next because it's just, the tropes of it all and the kind of understated things that people might have even forgotten about in the malaise, so to speak, of today's politics, and even the weird conspiracy culture that's out there at this point, which Pierce is constantly struggling to navigate, and so am I. You got to admit, we have a hard time, like really, like MK Ultra in and of itself, just the term, right? It's got problems because it's become an umbrella for so many things. In reality, it only relates to one set of programs. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot more going on. It doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot of influence being exerted through all sorts of assets, one way or another. But the funny thing is that we would have absolutely no concept of MK Ultra without somebody having to go back and do a forensic reconstruction of the financial documents that somebody forgot to destroy. Right?
Exactly.
So what remains in the destroyed pile that, is still hidden as a result of maybe you can't get everything together out of the forensic reconstruction, but what remains still out there and still unknown. And I find it an interesting parallel again that I brought up another thing to you in a message, Pierce, and I think this is worthy of mentioning too, is that when you see and you're, this guy with his comic book shows you some of this in a really interesting way. But when you see that the government proposes something behind closed doors. It's not because they don't think they're remotely capable of doing it. Okay, Northwoods, interesting example. Like people say, well, there's no way that you could have remote control planes, and you're saying that our government would participate directly in acts of terrorism. Well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed it, which meant that they felt they could execute it, or at least they had a reasonable chance of executing it. That was put on JFK's desk. You understand? So to imagine that things like that could occur today is not a stretch of the imagination. And just like with these programs where LSD and the elements of drug culture and the use of different things to control subgroups of individuals and various sort of sub-societies, or, what would be another way to describe that, Pierce?
So like subgroups, you're saying?
Yeah, like smaller niche groups in society to control them by infiltration and influence. I mean, it's not a crazy thing to imagine. Again, J. Edgar Hoover, who was not the most technologically sophisticated person on the planet, did that himself before he died quite a bit. COINTELPRO, they implanted people into the Ku Klux Klan. They implanted them into all sorts of political groups, peace activists, you name it, in order to exert influence, in order to create situations, not just to monitor, but it also has the added benefit of being able to surveil those that are difficult. So, you can almost see how a paranoia is not exactly a mental disease when it comes to some of these suppositions, because if you don't accept it as reality, then you are really just missing out on part of what these different agencies have had to admit over the years, whether it's the FBI, the CIA, DARPA, the military intelligence groups of various stripes, or, one of the 16 intelligence agencies we have in this country at this point in time. Not to mention who else might be doing something else from another nation. So at all times, it's like you're not paranoid if you think they're after you, and they actually are. So to some degree it's real, and some degree it's it could be the fevered pitch of imagination. And it's really cool to see, again, all of this kind of represented in this piece of art. And last thing I'm going to say is this. Every time I hear Grenada and that discussion, I somehow in my head accidentally have to fall back on Robert Downey Jr. in the movie Natural Born Killers.
Yeah.
Screaming, I saw it all go down in Grenada, mate, which I thought was hilarious at the time, and still do. But then again, you know what? Maybe he did. So there you go, Pierce.
Well, that's sort of like the power of whatever went on at Grenada. It's become like a joke. It's like a punchline. Like in Natural Born Killers, there's like a really funny reference to it there's a King of the Hill episode where they go to like it's like a military bar, and there's all these different, people, and they're all talking about, what was like the best war, or the best, and there's some guy that's, we had to get those students out in Grenada, and it's meant as a joke, and it is funny, but that's kind of like the power of some of these operations. And again, too, talk about like, mind control in a larger context. I mean, so many people are kind of brainwashed into believing that Grenada nothing really happened. There was no mental hospital that got bombed, or if it did, it was an accident. And there's really nothing to kind of look into. Why was this one place, as far as you've talked about, why was this only this one place that was targeted? That in and of itself is a bit odd. But, they've kind of convinced the public at large that there's really nothing here. So again, that's sort of like, again, that I hope that kind of brings in the idea of mind control in a much more broad sense, that we are controlled all the time through the use of media. And you can take something like Grenada and kind of boil it down to a punchline, or just a silly kind of like throwaway thing, or in like Natural Born Killers, where it's it's kind of like, he's like a nut who's a conspiracy person or something like that who's saying it, when in reality, I mean, there's a lot more happening.
Yeah, because he's obviously just a superficial media personality who isn't a real person, and therefore takes that seriously. So the joke's on you. because you should take it about as seriously as that, shallow caricature that revamped his career. So there you go, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, oh, no, jump in, Folly.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but I really wanted to thank Chuck, because he took the time to lay out why the documentary evidence of MKUltra and mind control is so shaky and is so precarious. That's exactly why we're in the situation where Kyle Reese in the police station talking some unprovable nonsense is something we can't always poo-poo. As much as we might want to, we might, be served better by taking a critical eye, certainly, to testimony that isn't 100% provable, but maybe needs to be taken into account in some regard.
And the Kyle Reese in the police station thing is one of the most brilliant analogies I've heard on radio in years, man. That is exactly right. So thank you for that.
Certainly. I would love to talk a bit more about future plans for the comic, if that would be.
Please, yeah. We've maybe about 7-8 minutes left. So why don't you definitely tell us, where you see this going, and is there any kind of hints or anything like that you can give to the listeners about future issues?
I can do my best without, spoiling things. So, currently I'm not able to work on the comic as often as I would like to. But my plan for content release is on a monthly basis at this point. At the end of this month, or end of next month, probably at the latest, the first issue will be 100% complete to my satisfaction. In my mind, it needs to be about twice as long. Ultimately, the next phase will be starting the next, comic anthology series. The next one, I think, will at least be a 2 or 3 part comic. And right now, I'm debating between two things. I have a whole list of notes to go through, various story seeds, with the two that jump out at me as being the most interesting and expanding on the current format that I have. One would be about South Korea, about the K-pop industry as it intersects with professional StarCraft. Another would be about Jack Ruby, his stripper girlfriend Candy Barr, and his connection to the Mafia.
Well, and with the K-pop, you're referring to StarCraft, the computer game, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I think it's no wonder that a country that has mandatory military service has a game where every young man is pretty much brutally regimented in order to be able to succeed at that game. You really have to have your mind be one with the machine in a very strange way to succeed at StarCraft. And I think that there is a parallel to be drawn with mind control. Maybe someone who doesn't understand this game may not know what I mean, but the idea that you have to have a completely regimented set of maneuvers, military maneuvers, that you conduct on a certain time frame basis, depending on what the enemy is going to do. When you play StarCraft, an hour can seem like 2 seconds because it's just how fast-paced it is. And the idea of in training almost all male South Korean youth to be a part of that is very interesting to me, and I think that lends to the subject of mind control exploration. And, of course, the K-pop industry, the vigilant citizen types will certainly point to all sorts of, monarch symbolism with the K-pop babes in their videos. I think that there is perhaps a story to be told there, and certainly no shortage of strange pseudo-cult-like scandals in South Korean politics to look into.
Oh, so I think that sounds fantastic. I really do hope you do that. And just back to the quickly the StarCraft thing. You're also talking about a place, South Korea being the first country that really kind of pushed computer games and video games into the realm of actual sport, where you can. I mean, now it's kind of you see that more and more where different people playing Call of Duty, or there's I forget what it's called. It's sort of did you ever play Dota?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, what Defense of the Ancients? Or no, what's the
League
one?
Of Legends.
League of Legends. Yeah. You see that, and you get these kids that are $1 million sponsorship, and they get these teams. That only really was possible because in South Korea they had been doing that for decades beforehand.
And the biggest corporations in South Korea who are in charge of it, SK Telecom, Samsung, it's a huge money, big corporate enterprise.
Yeah. That in and of itself is bizarre. And also the what you were saying there about the mind control and K-pop, there is like a weird, and also that like you have to be kind of like this, it's only like a type of mind that could play StarCraft at that competitive level. Also, I mean, you're talking about a society that's become so regimented and so uniform. Where you mean like the plastic surgery industry is so huge in Korea, and everyone is getting plastic surgery to kind of look the same and look uniform, and you see that mirrored in so much of the K-pop scene, where you could have 20 women in a group and they all like look like they could be related. And so much of that is this weird obsession with plastic surgery, and everyone should have a nose that looks exactly the same, and their cheekbones should be this way. So yeah, I think that is a really a territory that is ripe for exploration, and I cannot wait for you to explore that in a future comic. Very quickly, before we wrap it up, Folly, remind the listeners where they can go to get a copy of the comic, where they can go to support you, and where they can go to follow you.
Yes, thank you very much, Pierce. And as a side note, that's the one I'll do next. You've convinced me. That's it.
Yes, please.
So you can find my work at Black Budget Comics, comics with an X, .wordpress.com. The first issue of the comic is available there. If you want to email me to call me an asshole, you can go to blackbudgetcomics@gmail.com. That's my email address. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm black_budget on Instagram, and I am Comics X Black, comics with an X, Comics Black on Twitter. I have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/blackbudgetcomics. I would charge you on a per issue basis. So if I'm lazy and don't put anything out, it's not like you're going to be out a bunch of money. But, I would encourage people to buy the physical copies from me if they're interested in supporting me. I think it's the best way to do it.
Absolutely, yes, and I can't echo that enough. We'll link up to all of that in the show notes. I want to thank my guest, Folly Ado, for joining us here on the show. Please get a copy of his book. I want to thank everybody for listening, and also just to remind you that I will not be on the Ocelli Effect tonight, but you should absolutely tune in because good friend Robbie Martin is going to be filling in the guest host duties. So thank you all so much, and I'll be talking to you all very soon.